Welcome to the Environmental Due Diligence Podcast by Lightbox, the podcast dedicated to environmental professionals. At Lightbox, we are at the forefront of delivering solutions for commercial real estate intelligence. Today, our host, Alan Agadoni, Senior Vice President at Lightbox, talks with Anthony Buonicore, Chairman of Sustainable Real Estate Solutions, and the Task Group Chair for ASTM E322419, Standard Guide for Building Energy Performance and Improvement Evaluation in the Assessment of Property Conditions.
Welcome, listeners. Hi, Anthony.
How are you, Alan?
Doing great today. I've been looking forward to this one. All right, and for those of you who have been in the due diligence industry for more than 20 years, he needs no introduction. He's truly the OG of environmental due diligence, and if you don't know him, it could take hours to review all he's done in his career to provide a fitting introduction. So how about I just list some of the different hats he's worn over the last few decades, and we'll go from there. First, there's Anthony, the engineer. He started with a bachelor's and master's degree in chemical engineering from Manhattan College and is a licensed engineer. Number two, the entrepreneur, co-founded and successfully sold 4 companies: BCA Environmental Services, Chemrox, Hunter Environmental Services, and EDR. Then you founded SRS. Number 3, the industry practice leader for ASTM E1527, the E2797, BEPA standard, and the guide that we'll be talking about a bit more later, 322419 BEPIE standard for conducting building energy assessments, and much more. And finally, he's a commercial real estate investor, and I might add, someone who I consider an early mentor for whom I have a lot of questions. So let's start by taking a look back. Coming out of college, Anthony, what did you see that convinced you to pursue the career path that ultimately led to all of these achievements?
Well, first of all, thank you, Alan, for the kind words. As you said, my degrees are in chemical engineering, but I specialized in environmental. I specialized in environmental because I wanted to be exposed to as many different industries and operations as possible and not be stuck in a single industry, or even worse, become an expert on a single piece of equipment like a distillation column, as many of my peers would be doing. I believe that since chemicals contaminating the environment were likely created by chemical engineers, and it should be the chemical engineers who might be best suited to figure out how to eliminate the problem. And I started doing this. In fact, our first process was a process that was developed by our team that captured highly toxic ethylene oxide that was being discharged to the environment in the medical product sterilization field, and converted it to ethylene glycol, which, as you may or may not know, is antifreeze. We eventually patented the process. We manufactured the equipment and even installed it at medical products companies literally throughout the world. It was a win-win for our clients because they eliminated an air pollutant that was highly toxic and that was being discharged to the environment. And at the same time, they made money from the sale of antifreeze, the byproduct that was produced. So again, that was the process that we kind of followed as we started out once I had my own firm. And that's where I spent most of my time working on these types of processes.
So what came first? Was it the entrepreneur or the industry practice leader?
Well, without question, for me, it was the entrepreneur. Like many others in our field, I always wanted to have my own company, my own business, and kind of be in control of my own destiny. But before I could do this, I knew I needed to get some real world experience. So I spent time learning the ropes in a large chemical company in their environmental department. I worked as a sales engineer in a pollution control equipment manufacturer, and even went to work ultimately for an environmental consulting company. When I felt confident that I had the technical and business experience that I needed, made the move. But I did partner with a very smart, well-connected businessman who I worked with before, and we were off. In fact, I'm still with that partner 45 years later. In our first company, which was started as an environmental consulting company in 1980, we started, as you said, many other companies, with the last being EDR, which, as you know, we sold to the British media company, the Daily Mail, in 1999. Our latest company, Sustainable Real Estate Solutions, is a software as a service company, specializing in assessing the impact of energy efficiency measures in building. Alan, I've been lucky and fortunate, and I've always believed that you can't just take and take from an industry that's been really good to you without giving back in some way. And my way was volunteering in two professional organizations, the Air and Waste Management Association, where I worked on numerous technical committees and eventually on the board, and at ASTM, where I worked to develop a number of standards, as you mentioned in your introduction.
One of the themes that came across to me as I was looking at your resume and thinking about all the things that you've done over the years, because we've known each other for a long time, and is that I always kind of considered you to be uniquely qualified to kind of take the helm and run with some certain things like you've done, not only as an entrepreneur, but as an industry practice leader, because you combined a lot of the different stakeholders in one person. Who better to kind of sympathize with and deal with and build a consensus around some of the things that you did. So it made a lot of sense to me at the time. I'm sure it wasn't that easy, but we much appreciate that.
No one should ever discount the fact that there's luck involved. You work hard, but you still need luck.
Sure. Let's talk about EDR for a second. So speaking of EDR, what made you start that company? What was the inspiration behind that?
I started EDR after the sale of my last environmental consulting company, which was Hunter Environmental Services, in 1989. We did phase ones at Hunter, quite a few of them, but I noticed that we had the highest degree of turnover in this department. And then, of course, I was curious since I had headed all operations, and I figured, let me find out why. And the reason was that phase one work involved a huge amount of research work. And we had geologists who were doing the phase ones. And of course, they preferred to be in the field, drilling and soil testing and doing their geological work. Of course, when I asked what the worst part of the phase one work was, the answer always came back the same way. It was the work researching all the government and historical records on the property. Well, many of your listeners today may be too young to know, but government record searching in the late 80s and early 90s was by zip code, with the deliverable being a stack of computer paper, sometimes inches thick. And going through the stack, looking for your address in each property record was an unbelievably time-consuming undertaking. So after Hunter was sold, I had the idea that maybe this problem might present a good business opportunity. GIS technology was still in its infancy, but I believed it could be used to make electronic searching of government records possible. This was the start of EDR, 1990. And as you know, Alan, electronic searching has come a long, long way since then.
Thankfully, it has. But we appreciate the kickstart at the beginning for sure and all the development along the way. What I always wondered was the investment that you made in not only in building these businesses, but developing all these standards. What kind of inspired you to do that, like run both tracks at the same time? Because you were doing these things while you were building these businesses.
It's the way I was brought up. I just personally believe that if an industry or an area that you're in is really good to you, and the industry has been pretty good to me, you have to give back. You just can't take. And so it made sense to me that, working to develop standards that could level the playing field, which obviously was what we in the consulting community wanted as well. You wanted a level playing field, but it would also raise the bar for those working in the industry and provide clients with a greater degree of confidence in the quality of what they were getting. So all of those were kind of driving forces for me. You just can't take fundamentally. You got to be able to give back as well. And that's the way I did it.
And you certainly saw that there was a lot of elbow room in a newly emergent industry to take it to another level. So,
well, that's what really was exciting, Alan.
Yeah.
It was a new area. It was just emerging. And so, it wasn't there forever. Whatever you were doing was first time.
Yeah.
And, you're going to learn, make mistakes, as we did. I don't know, a lot of people don't know, but the first phase one standard, E1527, we came out with in 1991, had errors in it. And that's why we immediately, even before the standard was published by ASTM, we had to develop the 1992 version of the standard and correct them.
And I think there was a 93 standard too.
No, 94. 94 was
94?
94, yeah.
Right. It's just
it's evolving because you learn. You learn from your mistakes too.
And because the hits kept coming too, because not only were, things evolving internally within the industry, but you also had government regulations changing, bank policies changing, and all those things happened at the same time. In those early days, once the stake was planted into the ground, then you had all the feedback, and you had to
That's right.
then integrate that feedback. So that's really got the things rolling in the early 90s.
It was fun, though. It was a
Yeah.
fun time.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about some of the highlights. You built all these businesses. There had to have been a lot of hard times and good times. So what were some of the highlights, though, of those years for you?
Well, I'll say there were a lot of hard times too. No ifs, ands, or buts. But I'd say the first big highlight was when my team was awarded, or we were awarded our first patent in 1985. And it was on that detoxification of ethylene oxide. That was really rewarding. I mean, it was, first of all, just having a patent was very satisfying. So that was one. I can also say that, as I said, I was involved in the Air and Waste Management Association. But when I was elected president in 1994, I had the opportunity to travel all over the United States and actually all over the world. And that was really a highlight for me personally. But I have to say, every time we sold a company, and the fact that there was somebody else besides us who recognized the value in what we had created, that also was a highlight. Each one of them was a highlight. Those were some of the biggies.
Let's talk a little bit about Anthony, the investor. Are you still actively investing in commercial real estate?
Yes, but it's a little different than when we started. If you recall, Alan, because you and I had talked, I know about it way back in the early 90s. I got into it because I believed very early on, as I think you and many others in our field, that contaminated properties located in good areas, such as these high traffic intersections, they could be acquired at a significant discount, cleaned up, and eventually sold at a valuation close to the market rate. The market opportunity existed because I think, as you know, many property owners perceive the cost of cleaning a contaminated property to be greater than the value of the property. They had in the back of their mind the cost of cleaning up Superfund sites and the millions upon millions of dollars. But our expertise in remediating contaminated properties told us, for the most part, that that wasn't true. And over the years, partnering with commercial real estate investment firm, we acquired dozens of these types of properties, cleaned them up to get the NFA letters, and then sold them. But as with many things over time, we found it more and more difficult to find these properties that at a reasonable price. And this was really compounded because a whole host of companies also recognized the opportunity and came into the market as well. That really ended our venture into acquiring contaminated real estate. But I did learn a lot about commercial real estate and how profitable it could be, how profitable investment it could be, particularly from both a cash and a tax standpoint. So my partners and I continue to invest in real estate. So it's a long-winded answer, but the answer is yes, we do, but principally only in high-quality properties and mostly in multifamily and warehouse properties.
I remember those days early on when there were specialties developed around investing in contaminated properties before the big institutions even got that interested in doing it out of necessity. So maybe there was also some standard setting, some practice setting there too, that was picked up on. And ultimately now that's just kind of par for the course with the big institutions. They know a lot about doing what you kind of led the way on back in the 90s. So congrats on another leadership role there.
Yeah, but it was interesting. I mean, it was really the marketplace. You remember, Alan, investors were scared to death buying a contaminated piece of property because it was almost impossible to know what it's going to cost to clean it up. And the only thing out there was EPA saying that it's going to cost millions upon millions of dollars to clean up properties. And so it scared the hell out of them. But eventually, just like everybody else, they learn over time.
Let's talk about this, what's going on with some of the things that you're working on today. Just recently, you reached out to the 24 committee. I know I got that email, and you let us know that there was time to move forward with an update on the BEPIE guide. And before we get talking about that, why don't you explain the general intent and difference between the older BEPA standard and a BEPIE?
Okay, that's a good question. The older BEPA standard, the Building Energy Performance Assessment standard, was E2797, and it was directed solely at identifying how much energy a building used, period, and do it in a consistent and standardized manner. And the whole idea was to create a level playing field so that when numbers about how much energy your building used were required to be given to regulators and whatever, that there's no game playing. And we felt that that would create the level playing field. The Building Energy Performance and Improvement Evaluation, or BEPI standard that you're talking about, went way beyond this. But first, let me say that the BEPI standard came about because a number of states and municipalities developed legislation that required a building's energy consumption to be disclosed every year, with the results often being made public. Today, by the way, this includes, I believe it's 6 states and 58 cities and counties, with more coming on the horizon. The legislation effectively penalizes poorly performing buildings in the marketplace. For example, in New York City, Local Law 97 requires greenhouse gas emission limits to be met in commercial buildings. This typically is done by reducing the building's energy consumption, i.e., increasing the energy efficiency of what's there. If greenhouse gas emissions were not achieved, a fine of $268 per metric ton is levied on emissions exceeding what New York City considers the allowable limit. So effectively, building owners and commercial real estate investors now have more things to worry about. It could cost money if the building's energy performance is subpar. So the concept really behind the BEPI standard was to bring this building's energy performance and therefore indirectly greenhouse gas emissions into the commercial real estate due diligence process, where I believe it should be. And this way, a potential acquirer would know where the building stood with respect to the building's energy performance, just as they want to know all the other things in due diligence. The BEPI aligned itself with the ASTM E2018 PCA standard because most of the information needed to conduct the BEPI is already collected in the PCA, including information on the remaining useful life of major mechanical systems, such as air conditioners, boilers, water heaters, what have you. The BEPI is designed to evaluate a building's energy consumption and compare it with the energy consumption of peer buildings. If it performs worse than peer buildings, the BEPI assesses the impact of replacing existing equipment having little or no remaining useful life with high efficiency and typically more expensive equipment, rather than just code-compliant equipment, which is usually the cheaper way to go. The objective is to get the building's energy performance to at least the level of peer buildings. Any cost penalty to do this, just as with other physical deficiencies in the PCA that have been uncovered in the PCA, that could become another consideration in purchase price negotiation. So again, the whole idea is to bring this building performance into the commercial real estate due diligence process and fundamentally do it by looking at peer buildings and see how you compare with peer buildings. And in the BEPI, the new BEPI standard, and when it was originally came out in 2019, that was the whole objective, what it was trying to do. I may not have done it in the best way, as you'll see later if we get a chance to talk about it. But still, it's the goal. It was a noble goal, and I still believe in it.
With most of these standard revisions, and we've talked about a few of them on these podcasts in the last couple of months, there's the idea that attitudes, priorities, science, practices all evolve during the time from when any standard is published. So in 2019, the BEPI standard was published. How have things changed? And what is your take on energy efficiency in commercial real estate in 2024, 2025?
Well, I think I kind of alluded to it. I think the energy efficiency of buildings today has grown to such an extent that I believe personally that you can no longer ignore it. It's synonymous with the whole clean energy transition wave that's been moving across the country and the world, especially over the last 3 to 4 years. More efficient buildings have lower operating costs, and they're more valuable in the marketplace. Those are two things that commercial real estate owners and investors pay a huge amount of attention to. So a successful green energy transition can only be achieved, in my view, if we reduce our energy use. And improving energy efficiency would be the first step in being able to do that. So I really believe in that whole concept of getting energy efficiency of buildings to the highest extent that you can.
If you sit with a bunch of commercial real estate investors or lenders, capital markets people today, they talk about energy is a big topic because, in every state, there's some question about how they're going to generate the energy they need to power electric cars and all the batteries and everything that's coming on, all these data centers for AI. It's really one of the more hotter topics in real estate. So I think I'm with you on the idea that, what started out as kind of a look at office and multifamily and those kinds of things can become something even more when you take a look at things like data centers and elsewhere. So plenty of room there for more
Absolutely.
growth. So one of the things we've learned about ASTM standard revisions over the last few months in talking with others who've done it is they usually kind of start with their lessons learned since they published the standard. Like you said, even ASTM E1527 went through this whole process many times. So what are some of the lessons learned on the BEPIE standard?
Well, there's a lot from the time it first came out in 2019. I think first and foremost, we learned that rather than using individuals who perform the PCA, which is what we originally had thought would do the BEPI, most of the firms that were asked to evaluate building energy performance at the time of a real estate transaction, they relied on their energy specialists, who typically from the energy services part of the firm, not the PCA part of the firm. Conducting the 3224 BEPI screen was just apparently believed to be too intimidating and a bit overwhelming by those who, typically perform PCAs. This was something we had to recognize in the update and in the revision, and we did seriously consider it, and we think that the new standard certainly will address this. Along the same lines, we also learned from doing these PCAs that the BEPI standard as written was confusing and assumed too much, including, for example, that the person conducting the BEPI should have some basic understanding of building energy performance. And this wasn't the case, and this therefore had to be taken into consideration in the revised BEPI standard, which we did. And I think, I don't know if you had a chance to look at the ballot that's going to be going out in January, but I think we addressed these types of things. Another lesson we learned was that it was interesting. Most of the firms found it challenging to get a higher price for PCA when a BEPI screen was included in the scope of work. I think our task group generally believes that this is probably because the individuals conducting the PCAs often were not familiar with the building performance disclosure regulations and the fines that could be levied on poorly performing buildings and other things that were more energy related. This was also considered in the revised BEPI standard, and we did this by expanding the legal appendix if you had a chance to look at it, Alan. Fortunately, the situation was a lot better, I think and I think you alluded to it, when PCAs were conducted on multifamily property, following Fannie Mae's high-performance building assessment protocol. I assume the benefit to the prospective purchaser was a sufficient enough driving force to cover the extra costs. They got that financial benefit. So that was important. The last other thing that was kind of interesting is there's this thing called a split incentive in the energy industry, in the building energy performance industry, and it's a barrier. And before I get into why it's a barrier, just understand what it is. It's related to the fact that most commercial real estate properties are under triple net leases, where the tenants typically have responsibility for the operating costs, including paying the utility costs, such as electricity and gas, in addition to property taxes and insurance. The split incentive problem arises because the capital cost of new high-efficiency equipment would have to be paid for by the building owner, but the benefit would be accrued by the tenant in the form of paying lower utility costs. This makes it challenging to get a building owner often to upgrade to more expensive high-efficiency equipment rather than installing equipment just meeting code. However, I think that the growing popularity of these green leases may have a positive impact here, but we'll have to wait and see. And now I think personally that more and more of the building owners are understanding the advantages of installing high-efficiency equipment, not only on the value of their building, but also tenants want to see buildings that are energy efficient, at least in my view. But in any event, it should be evident now that one of the most important goals of our BEPI revision, in addition to updating, was to clarify many sections of the standard and make it much easier to use when a PCA is conducted by due diligence professionals. Many of the sections of the standard have been rewritten to be much more logical and contain additional guidance and reference material. We even added a new appendix that contains a flowchart of the BEPI screening process with appropriate descriptions of each step. We saw how valuable that was in the 1527 revision. Those flowcharts can be a huge advantage. In any event, our task group believes that this updated, revised standard, it should be much less intimidating and much easier to use in adding a building energy performance assessment to the building due diligence process.
And one of the things that we see come up in when revisions of standards happen is integrating new technology that may have changed from the time the standard was published. So is there anything there for the BEPIE standard? Is there technology impacting or improving in any way the process there, you think?
It's a relatively new area, obviously.
Mhm.
It's not an area like 1527 that's been around for a long, long time. But technology can come into play, I think primarily because there's so much more software available online that's directed at, doing building energy consumption, calculating building energy consumption from electricity and gas data, calculating energy savings when you're replacing existing equipment with high efficiency equipment. And this includes software that's available at no cost online from DOE, for example, through their Federal Energy Management or FEM program, I think, as you know, and also by DOE's labs, including NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, and DOE's Pacific Northwest National Lab. There's also quite a bit of software that's now being offered by the equipment manufacturers themselves and by a number of consulting companies. The technology is slowly coming into play. It's going to take time, as it took time with 1527 and the phase one, but it will, I'm sure, eventually play a much more important role.
Yeah, I think so too. Even if it's just more data, better access to data, that was always, I remember, a problem at the very early stages too, was you go to a building and you'd ask them for their records on energy consumption. They'd look at you as, what records would those be? You mean our bills?
But one of the technologies that's happening is because utilities have been asked so much, they're developing systems that allow people to access all of the, you or me can access a building with their permission, of course, the building's electricity data or utility data for the last year, 2 years, whatever we want. So the utilities, they've got technology that's slowly being integrated into this process as well.
Yeah, I think that'll be helpful, very helpful, knowing from past experience. Let's kind of wrap up the BEPIE. What's the timing on the update? Are you still looking for feedback and or collaboration on kind of, dotting the I's and crossing the T's? And if so, how does somebody get involved?
Well, ASTM will be sending out our task group, as you know, has had this for months to go through the dotting the I's, crossing the T's. And we have a ballot that's going to go out probably mid-January by ASTM. And as with all ASTM ballots, it'll allow for comments. And every comment received will be reviewed by our task group at our ASTM spring meeting, the week of April 7th in Toronto. It'll be at the Sheraton. And our task group I think it's scheduled the afternoon of Tuesday, the April 8th. Whether or not additional balloting will be necessary or more changes depends on what we receive in the form of comments, and also, importantly, if any negatives are submitted. But our hope, and we keep our fingers crossed, is to have the updated and revised standard published no later than the fall of 2025. So it should be, we're hoping, a 2025 standard.
Excellent. And when that gets published, let us know and we'll help get the word out.
I appreciate that.
Okay, so, when I was preparing for this and we were talking about doing this interview, one of the things I couldn't not do, pardon the double negative, is talk about Ask Tony. I mean, everybody has their brand, right? And early on, one of Tony's brands was, I'll explain for the folks that weren't there, there was a publication called, that EDR did called ESA Report back in the day. And it was a very valuable publication. It was the only thing in our industry at the time that spoke to people conducting phase ones directly and also the user stakeholders too. So it was something that I know myself and my peers who were either just getting started or, kind of figuring things out like we all were, would read pretty religiously. And one of the features of the ESA report was a monthly column called Ask Tony, where you would quite graciously, among other things, answer numerous questions about, is this a wreck? Hypotheticals, and comment on all sorts of emerging ESA topics. So it was a lot of fun, but I had to ask you, what was either the funniest, strangest, or some of the more notable experiences you had in that Ask Tony column?
Well, Alan, thank you. You're going back 25 years, to the middle 90s. Anyway, there are a couple of things that are non-rec questions, a lot of rec questions, as you indicated, but there were some interesting non-rec questions and that I can recall. And I think one of the more common questions that I received was related to who can rely on phase one report, because it wasn't unusual, if you remember in those days, that phase one report would get circulated among all sorts of people involved in the transaction, but many of them had nothing to do with the report's commissioning or the scope of work or anything. And consultants were concerned about potential liability. And as you know, this made reliance rather, an important topic to be addressed in the phase one scope of work and in the report's cover letter. I can also recall questions raised by a number of lenders who related. They wanted to know about the difference between a phase one and a transaction screen when both are performed by an EPA, with, of course, the fact that they knew the transaction screen was being less expensive and lenders were always looking for a way to cut costs. As you know, this was addressed in the last transaction screen update, standard update. 1528 was specifically stated, and we continually maintain that the transaction screen is a very limited ESA, and it's not a phase one. And it doesn't satisfy all appropriate inquiry and can't be used as defense to circular liability. But interestingly, even I recall a related question about the same time by a number of EPs who were pretty adamant. They were adamant that and questioned whether the transaction screen can even be performed by a non-EP. They advocated that certain questions in the transaction screen at the time required special expertise of an EP. For example, the question on whether it's anything on a property or an adjoining property that suggests the use is likely to lead to contamination of the property. And they had a bunch of them, and they argued and said, well, the transaction screen really can't be done by a non-EP. And what they did was they took the transaction screens, if you recall, and moved it off to the side, and everybody just focused on phase ones. Another question that I recall, it was really interesting. It was how much reliance can you place on a phase one reported by another firm? Got a phase one report. Remember, phase one reports as time went on, the likelihood of having at least one, maybe two or three phase one reports on the property increased. And the question was, how can you really rely on that? How much can you rely on it? It was a big concern because EPs have always been concerned about potential liability. And with respect to potential liability, there was always the questions about litigation against phase one firms. I tried to, in Ask Tony Collin, focus wherever I saw a citation, I would try to bring it out so at least people would learn from it. But more and more phase one firms were being sued. The big question is, why aren't there more citations? Because the EPs obviously can learn by other firms being sued. Personally, and I believe this was true, because the vast majority of cases, they were there, but they were continued to be settled confidentially by both the phase one firms and their E&O insurers, and I think for obvious reasons. The only other question that kind of pops into my head, which was kind of a funny one, with a group of consultants, and they always were a group that was very adamant when they reviewed Ask Tony. How could consultants offer to do the ASTM 1527 phase one for less than $1,000? And they said some of them were doing it for $200 or $300. How is this possible? What can we do? You can guess what the EP feedback on that was. But those were some of the interesting, funny ones, the ones that at least that I recall. There are probably others too, but those are the ones that I recall.
Well, it'll make you feel better when we've been doing our webinars here and trying to field questions and get responses back from expert EPs. We get the same questions
Still
sometimes. Yeah, no, really things have gotten a lot more sophisticated, and there's this consensus and understanding that's grown over the years. But you'll still get people coming out and saying, how can somebody compete and do these things? And I understand, and I just say, I hear you, and that's something you'll have to learn as you participate in this business. Supply and demand. Speaking of surprise, what are some of the things that surprised you? You have this great perspective looking back over the years. What surprised you about some of the progress that's been made in commercial real estate, environmental due diligence industry in general? So things have come a long ways. What surprised you about that?
Well, I think what surprised me the most is how far the quality of phase ones has progressed since the late 80s when we first started performing them. And I believe that's a direct result of the 1527 standard and how it's evolved since 1991. I believe it's going to evolve, quality is going to evolve even further with this new ASTM certification program that they're beginning. And that's going to help. That's the quality that's improved and keeps improving, which I think is fantastic. I also have to say that I'm amazed at how much more information can be incorporated into a phase one without really sacrificing the time it takes to complete the phase one. And I believe there's a lot, to a large extent, as I'm sure you do, Alan, it's the result of how much more information can be accessed electronically immediately. Those two things just, they amaze me. They surprise me, but they do amaze me, both of them. And I think they're both important.
They are, and kind of reaching a path of most resistance when it comes to how much data is coming at us these days. So one of the key things that out there that people are talking about is AI and how that might be able to help the due diligence industry at least achieve some efficiency, if not some quality upgrades. But do you have any thoughts on AI and how it might impact commercial real estate transactions or environmental due diligence?
Absolutely do. I'm a believer, an advocate for AI. I believe it's going to have a significant role. And as you know, Alan, these systems can analyze vast amounts of data, including commercial real estate data, including everything from government records, historical records, zoning records, building permits, legal regulations, geological and soils data, among so much more. I believe AI has the potential to transform commercial real estate due diligence, and at least initially, do this principally by streamlining operations, increasing productivity, and further improving quality. But off the top of my head, there's probably a couple areas that might benefit from the AI role. I certainly can see AI effectively being used as kind of like a virtual assistant to the environmental professional conducting due diligence. This could vastly improve efficiency, productivity, enhance quality, and enable more informed decision-making, which I think is important. I eventually believe there's going to be an AI database containing all property records, as I alluded to before, everything from which AI can learn about properties and adjoining properties, which will be a huge benefit to environmental professionals conducting due diligence. Or I also believe that within firms themselves, AI can be a help because they can take all the company's phase one reports that they've done, and some of them, as you know, have done literally thousands upon tens of thousands of phase one reports. Mm-hmm. AI can grab all that and learn, ask questions, make recommendations, make predictions. I can even envision AI preparing the draft phase one report. And in the process of doing this, not just raise questions, it may even suggest answers, all of which could provide EPs with new insights about the target property. Notwithstanding, despite all that I've said about AI and all it potentially can do in the due diligence sector, I still believe, and maybe because I'm so old, that the human element will always remain important, and that AI work output will only be as good as the professionals using it, certainly in my lifetime.
Yeah, well said. I think certainly it's an open issue right now as to how far and how quickly things will go with AI and due diligence, but it does seem like there's going to be a lot of opportunity there for improvement, and kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, where you had a wide open field back in the 80s and saw some opportunity and took advantage of it. And I think there's going to be those type of opportunities for young folks coming up in the industry right now, and for anybody coming up in the industry right now who wants to take the initiative and be ambitious and smart about it. So it could be one of those things that could turn some heads and create some new leaders that will really move things forward. So that's something to look forward to.
Are you thinking of starting a new ASTM standard, Alan, on AI?
No, that's not what I do best. I think somebody like yourself. Recently we published that PFAS benchmark survey, the first PFAS benchmark survey for our industry. And we asked some interesting questions about PFAS due diligence. Do you have any comment on what's going on with PFAS today and with respect to bringing it into the phase one ESAs?
Yeah, as I was reading the document that you prepared, I see a lot of similarities in what we faced when we first developed the phase one. In fact, when SARA first was passed in 1986, and PFAS, what's going on today. Remember, at the time that SARA was passed in the late 80s, I think it was 86, there's no definition on what constituted AAI, all appropriate inquiry. And I recall there were a whole bunch of definitions. Environmental consulting firms had at the time kind of two beliefs, predominant beliefs. One, that sampling was required, it should be done, and one that no sampling should be done. I question this whole thing precipitated what our industry did. We got together back in 1989 and we decided to work through ASTM to develop a consensus. And as you know, after 2 years of really intense debate, we finally achieved consensus with the publication in 91 of E1527. The question, of course, now is, should sampling be required or not? If so, when and how? That's the PFAS question that kind of pops into my mind. Should sampling be required? Should it not? If so, when, how, etc. There's a lot of confusion, as I see in the marketplace, certainly in the consulting industry, and clearly in the commercial real estate investment and lender communities as well. But just as with AAI back in late 80s and ASTM, what ASTM did to achieve consensus, I personally believe that eventually consensus is going to be achieved on PFAS. Not sure what it's going to be, but it'll eventually be achieved, and there'll be some sort of standard that will or be factored into the E1527 standard in some way.
I think we'll see something like that happen down the road for sure. And so we're rolling into 2025. Do you care to make any predictions or comments about the state of commercial real estate in 2025 after a couple of forgettable years?
Well, from my experience, my perspective, I think the commercial real estate market in 2025 is going to continue to face challenges, at least that I see it. Conditions are going to continue to remain soft, although I do believe there's been some measure of stability finally arrived at. I'm seeing some stabilization, for example, in property prices and even a modest increase in certain valuations. This could mark a significant turning point from the way these things have been over the last few years. So if I have to say anything about it, I'll just say I'm cautiously optimistic about 2025. That's about all.
I'll take it. Okay, we're going to wrap things up here in a second, but before we do, what are you doing for fun these days?
Well, my golf game, I'm still playing golf. As you know, I love golf, but unfortunately, it's deteriorating as I get older. My driving distance is lousy now. My iron play is lousy. My putting is lousy, but I still love to play golf, and I do play it as much as I can.
Spoken like a true golfer.
Yeah, I'm a masochist at heart, and I like to travel, and I do quite a bit of traveling, both in the U.S. and internationally, conducting workshops for the energy professionals primarily on building energy efficiency, with a focus on converting energy savings into the language of real estate, cash flow. I've always said that the real greening of commercial real estate is with the color of money. And so I do like to travel, and often I take my wife with me. So we've had the opportunity to travel not only extensively in the US, but throughout the world, and conducting these courses. It's enjoyable. I enjoy it. It's a lot of fun. Certainly, I've seen people overseas just love to hear what's going on in the United States for reasons that are not crystal clear to me, but they love hearing whatever we're doing. So I will certainly satisfy them there.
And another hat that you wear is author. I understand you have a new book, Energy Savings Calculations for Commercial Building Energy Efficiency, on CRC Press. Anything you want to talk about on that?
No, if you're interested in doing the energy saving calculations, it's loaded with examples. As an engineer, I need examples. I have to look at example problems. So there's almost 100 example problems with all the calculations and the things that you have to do. So that to me is it's a 400-page book, but to me is one of the biggies. The tons of examples that are in the book. It was published this summer by CRC Press, and as I understand, it's got a pretty good sale in the industry. So I keep my fingers crossed. But by the way, when I teach courses, I use that as the
absolutely. And I took a look through the outline, and I saw that you had things broken down by system. Very, very logical, of course. Very much has your signature on it. So I would encourage everybody to take a look at it. Excellent assist there. Very specific and very targeted. Anything else you want to touch on before we close?
Well, before we close, I certainly want to wish all of the listeners, your listeners, a happy and healthy new year. Thank you, Alan.
And to you as well, Anthony. And we're out of time here, but I just want to say, I want to personally thank you for all your hard work and leadership and the risk-taking that you took, and because it played such a large part in the development of the environmental due diligence industry, all the tools and practices that we use today. I mean, I think the whole environmental industry, and let's add the building energy due diligence industry, owes you a huge thank you. So from me and the industry, I say thank you, and thank you for spending time chatting with us today. It was really a lot of fun, and let's do it again.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you for listening to the Environmental Due Diligence Podcast by Lightbox. Tune in next month for timely coverage of news and issues impacting commercial property due diligence. This podcast was produced by Josh Bruton. Access this episode and all our future episodes at lightboxre.com/podcast or your favorite podcast streaming platform. Until next time.